Okay, so this is the talk about empathy, and I'm going to start out by empathizing with your situation, which is that it's dark, you've been in here for quite a while, you've eaten, and there's going to be temptation to fall asleep. My intention is to stop that from happening, or at least make it as uncomfortable as possible for you to make that decision, or for your body to sort of overrule and make that happen. So today what we're going to talk about is how empathy can not just make the world a better place for all of us, but can actually become a force multiplier for the brands that you're leading and for the companies that you run. Go to the next slide. I don't have the, is there a clicker or do you guys advance it? Oh, it's on the thing. That was an obvious one. So first, let me tell you a little bit about myself. As she mentioned, my name is Ryan. I spent 12 years in the big CPG space, worked at Clorox, worked for a number of other folks before starting a company called Smoketown. And what we do is brand strategy and design and consumer research to help build brands that matter, to build brands that are in a position to change the world. But they do those things because they're actually anchored in a real consumer problem. We like to think of ourselves, and we really lean into this idea of empathy. And so I'm super thrilled to talk you through that today. Just so you know, if you want to snap a picture of this, it's going to come up later. The tool that I'm going to take you through is actually also on our website. So if you find it useful and you want to refer back to it at another point, you can check it out. You can check it out here. When I think of empathy, what I think of most, like the first person that comes to mind to me is Anthony Bourdain. And the reason the late Anthony Bourdain is my go-to, is who I think of when I think of empathy, is that unlike a lot of other celebrity chefs and sort of that whole Food Network scene, what he was particularly good at was, and what he leaned into, was that he didn't just he wasn't just fascinated over the food, over the culinary technique, over what was being done. He actually wanted to understand where the food came from. Why? How? What's the story behind it? What are the politics? What is the history that came together to make the dish? He was willing to sit on dirt floors or in hole-in-the-walls or walk up to a street vendor and have conversations to understand the why. So at its heart, empathy is about not just having the ability to understand where other people are coming from. Empathy is about being willing to understand where people are coming from. Everyone in this room has some level of ability to understand where people are coming from because that's wired into our consciousness. It's part of who we are. It's part of what it means to be human. But being willing to actually lean into that is quite another thing. So why is that the place that we're starting this conversation? Well, the reason for that is that at its heart, building brands, marketing brands, getting people to buy stuff, at its heart is an exercise in empathy. It's an exercise in what we think of as consumer empathy. You want to understand, why is it that someone would part with money or time to buy what you've created? Why? For those of you who want to nerd out along with me and Google this, and if you Google this while I'm talking and therefore stop paying attention to me, I won't take offense. I've got a 15-year-old and a 13-year-old, so the idea of being ignored is like, I'm battle ready for that reality. But there's this idea that we're going to be using throughout the next 25 minutes or so, that is jobs to be done theory, or jobs theory. And the core idea of it is that anytime any of you, me, my kids, my wife, anytime we buy something, a brand, a service, we're hiring that brand or that product to do a job for us. And 90% of the time, we're firing something else, at least in that occasion. And so the idea of consumer empathy is really getting to the bottom of why is my brand being hired? Why might we be hired? And what's likely to be fired and why? So what we're going to spend time together today doing, and be forewarned that there's going to be actual work that you have to do at your table, or at least that I'm going to ask you to do at your table, and I may actually call on volunteers, and in the absence of volunteers, I may actually conscript someone into joining me on the stage. So it might make sense to at least pay attention for the next few minutes, because we're going to talk about this idea of empathy, but actually let me go back and sort of go into an example of this that's also going to tie to my story. I flew in this morning, I got a latte. So what it looks like to be empathetic as a marketer, as a brand builder, is to not just see this as a latte that gives someone caffeine or like that gives someone sugar. You want to understand, why is it being consumed? What's going on? What's the deeper purpose that someone hired that product for? So I'll use myself as an example. For me, I have a ritual every morning. I get a latte from the same place. I get exactly the same kind. And the reason that I do it is it's like a reward for me for getting my ass out of bed, getting on the L, and going after it. That is my reward. I put a deposit in the account, emotionally and otherwise, every morning. And the only way that works for me personally is that the latte itself has to have a certain sort of luxurious experience around it. It's got to be rich, it's got to be creamy. If it's not those things, it falls short of doing the job that I hired it for, which is precisely what happened to me this morning when I got to the hotel and I went to the Starbucks, and Starbucks couldn't make the latte that I actually needed. I bought it because I also happened to need the caffeine in that instant, but it didn't give me everything that I wanted, and I literally am standing here right now feeling short of what I needed. But I'm not going to let you recognize that. So why does it matter to really understand the role of a latte in my life? Why does empathy work? Well, the first reason that it works is that it makes it more likely that you'll find the right people to become early adopters of your brand. Many of you are building, or you're in the early stages, you're sub $1 million. That means you're in proof of concept phase. And to tie this to the talk that was right before mine around fundraising, early stage investors, the most important thing that they're looking for at this stage, I think, is traction. You don't have to be a $3, $5, $10 million brand. You can be a $400,000 brand, but you need to demonstrate that you have traction in the market. What is traction? Traction is human beings parting with money and buying your stuff because they're early adopters. To the degree that you can understand the kinds of problems that your brand is able to solve in people's lives, you're more likely to find early adopters. The second piece is that you want to be able to say the right thing when you see those early adopters and when they show up. How do you decide if you're Oatly, a brand of oat milk, if you guys are, live under a rock and you've never heard of it? If you're Oatly, how do you decide what you're going to say on this tiny little package that consumers will give you 7 seconds of their attention to look at? Well, you want to be able to say something that differentiates your brand. You want to be able to say something that deeply connects with the problem that you're being hired to solve, so that they recognize you as a solution for that problem more than all of the other assorted options available to them. So we start here because what we're going to talk about going forward is what are the ways to deepen your skill set around empathy so that you're more likely to find the right consumer, and when you find the right consumer, say the right thing to them. In particular, what that's about is pushing beyond the obvious. All of us have an intuition about why we've created the product. And not to disrespect anyone in the room, but it is often the case that the first reason that you create the product is kind of the most obvious one. It's readily available to lots of people. For example, you want to create something that's, that's paleo because you were sick of bread not being an option when you're paleo. Or to give a shout out to Bread Seriously in the house, you want gluten-free you want sourdough, but you're gluten intolerant or you've walked away from gluten, and it's a bummer. So now you're looking for a gluten-free sourdough. But that's the surface level problem being solved. What we're gonna do is push beyond the obvious, because the more compelling the insight, the more complicated and deep you can go in understanding consumer psychology, the more likely you're gonna find a super differentiating and interesting place for your brand to stand. So again, this concept and this framework that we're gonna go through is on our website. You can do this at any point. And where we're gonna start, I'm going back to Oatly. So what is the obvious problem that Oatly solves? One version of that obvious problem is, I want a dairy-free milk that I can also enjoy. Straightforward, right? What's the problem with this, or what's the challenge with this as the problem to be solved? There's umpteen other dairy alternatives that would say exactly the same thing. Multiple brands of oat milk, almond milk, soy milk, coconut milk, etc. So how do you actually build a differentiated proposition when there's all these other brands sitting right on top of exactly the same insight? Well, a hint buried in here that we're gonna unpack a little bit is the idea, this is a contradiction. This sentence is a contradiction. I want dairy-free milk that I can also enjoy. Anytime you hear someone say that I can also, or but, that, etc., it indicates that there's a problem, there's a disconnect between what they want and what's reality. So we're gonna get into the habit of asking ourselves 3 questions in order to deepen our understanding of the problem being solved to get to a more interesting and differentiated place. So the questions we're gonna ask are, what's the emotional driver of this problem? We're gonna do that real time right now. So with Oatly, what's the emotional heart of the problem of dairy-free milk that I can also enjoy? Well, the role that dairy milk has in people's lives, regardless of what recipe or what food it's being used in, it brings a certain level of nostalgia. It brings a certain level of warmth, of emotional uplift, a reward, whether it's ice cream or it's a latte or it's a cup of milk with cookies. For anyone who actually grew up drinking dairy milk, it occupies, regardless of how you use it, it occupies a particular place. It does something for you that is tied up in the quality of the experience. So that's what's emotionally going on when someone says that I can also enjoy. The second question that we ask is, well, why are the current solutions inadequate? Speaking for myself, but there's also obviously millions of people who agree with this. The fact is that most alternatives to dairy milk are not fatty, they're not thick, they're not rich, they don't bring almost any of the product attributes that dairy milk has. Why does that matter? It matters because of what we just said. There's this deeper emotional need that's driving someone to want to drink a glass of milk or to use milk in whatever the recipe is. And if the product fails to live up to that, well, then the need's not being satisfied, which leads to that product, that brand, being fired as soon as a better alternative comes along. So that was essentially the stage that had been set when almond milks and soy milks and coconut milks and hemp milks all entered the marketplace. They entered the marketplace, grabbed lots of opportunity. Those are obviously huge businesses. I'm not here to suggest that they're not. However, they had a vulnerability. And the vulnerability was that there's certain aspects of the experience of drinking milk that they simply did not live up to. So when did that problem, the third question we ask ourselves when we're trying to get better at this is, when is the problem most pronounced? When is it at its worst? So now we're going to go back to my latte experience. For me and for lots and lots of other people, the stress test for a dairy-free milk is, can it produce a kick-ass latte? Will the latte look like that? Will it foam? Will it be fatty? Is it thick? Is it this luxurious, rich experience that lives up to the deeper reason that I've hired it, for the job that I've hired it for? And the reality is that many of those milk alternatives simply did not live up to that challenge. And that's speaking from the place of the consumer as one of us in this room who would go to the bar, who would go to the barista and say, I want X, Y, or Z drink. But consider another customer in this equation, which is the actual barista. They're a huge part of Oatly's business, the food service side of it. And the barista has a different problem to solve. They're craft people. Particularly, I'm not talking about like the national chain baristas necessarily. I'm talking about the hole in the wall, the hipster joint, the equivalent of Blue Bottle for those of you who know California, coffee and can nerd out with me for a moment on high quality coffee. That's the barista who also has a problem to solve with dairy-free milk. Because when they have a craft, they're the ones who invented pouring this, like having a lotus leaf or whatever that is, magically appear in your cup in the way that they pour the latte. Consider the level of craftsmanship and commitment to art that it takes to bother with that. And how much of a bummer it is when the customer shows up and the customer asks for an almond milk latte, and you know that you cannot make that happen in the same way when it's an almond milk latte. You just can't do it. It sucks for them, right? So with that stage set, you now can see that there's a few more things that we can leverage and that we can focus on that are problems to be solved beyond just the obvious, I want dairy-free milk that I can also enjoy. So to bring this home, there's a fascinating article in Refinery 29 that you can either Google for yourself or you can follow me on LinkedIn and find it because I posted about it, that talks about Oatly's problem with constantly running out of supply. Are there any Oatly fans in here who know that you cannot, you cannot get it? There's literally a black market for Oatly. I'm not lying. This is the truth, God's truth. There is a black market for Oatly. And why is that? It's not by accident, folks. It's because that team, early on, and this article unpacks it, they listened with empathy to who were the early adopters, and in particular, why were they adopting? What was the lightning in the bottle that this brand had stumbled upon? And what it came down to, I'm actually just going to read this because I think that it says it for itself. The coffee community is so connected and wired. When they see a product that allows them to elevate the coffee experience, underlined, elevate the coffee experience, they're so vocal and enthusiastic and passionate about it that it really expands. Key words, elevate the coffee experience. So remember, we started out thinking that the problem to be solved was, I want a dairy-free milk that I can actually enjoy, and we've evolved to consider that at least one more nuanced and more interesting thing being done is that it allows a barista to do what they love, which is to elevate the coffee experience for every single customer that walks in the door. Oatly's team figured that out, and when you read this article, they went out of their way to make sure that in the short supply situation that they were in, that cafes, baristas got their supply. Why? because they were the early adopters and a good sort of source of cash flow early on. I'm sure that was part of it. But also because they knew that those baristas were influencers and would become a force multiplier for that brand as it expanded. So fast forward, last year I think the brand grew something like 1,250%. That's a real number, 1,250%, and that's not funny money math, on a small base where they went from $5, to $5,000. That's not that math. They were already a sizable business last year, and that's the kind of number that they put up according to this piece. Again, not by accident, because they recognized this deeper problem that was being solved, they catered to it, and I would argue, and some of this they might have stumbled upon this, but I would argue that even in the packaging choices that they made, the design choices that they made for this specific SKU, when they for one, chose to come out with a barista SKU, which they didn't have to do, but they recognized that that was a huge opportunity early on in their business in the US. And then I love that in their sort of quirky, subtle way, they highlighted the fact that this actually foams. They didn't have to say it. They didn't have to go overboard with it. But a barista might look at this, recognize the idea that they're promising something that all these other brands had also promised and failed on, and when the product actually lived up to it, it took off. So that is the core of what we are about to do together as a team, or you at your table with your pieces of paper. Somebody bring the lights up for me, please. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to run through that same exercise. We're going to ask ourselves those same 3 questions. Choose either the brand that you're currently nurturing or the company that you lead. It's your call. And when you look on your table, you should find this at your table. There may not be enough at your table, but there are definitely enough in the room. So if you don't have enough, look to the table next to you, and they probably do. And so here's what I'm going to ask you to do for the next couple of minutes. There's 3 steps. They're literally the 3 steps that we just walked through together on stage. Thinking about your brand and who you think the consumer is, the first thing you're going to do is say, what's the obvious problem being solved? What's your version of, I just want a dairy-free milk that I can enjoy? And then ask yourself, what's the emotional driver to that need? Why are other things inadequate? Why are other solutions inadequate? And when is this need most pronounced? After you work through that middle section, write a new list of the problems that you think your brand is positioned to solve, taking into account these things that you learned in the middle. Okay? Okay. So this is the moment of truth when I will either be so glad that I invited audience participation, or I will be so regretful that I invited audience participation. So who feels like they went through the exercise, got it figured out, or maybe didn't get it figured out, but you made it far enough that you'd be willing to come up here and share your experience and talk? Quite a few people. Boom, look at that. The first hand I saw go up is the gentleman in the army green shirt. Good. Join me. I'm Ryan.
Peter.
Awesome. So maybe just help us all out by telling us a little bit about who you are, like what brand you're building, and then get into what you learned.
So name of my company is Personalized Nutrients, and we have a N of 1 manufacturing system where we can do 1 batch for 1 patient.
1 batch for 1 patient. Patients in what? When you say patient, what do you mean?
Yeah, so these are nutraceuticals, so dietary supplements as medicine. So
Dietary
patients
supplements.
of doctors.
Got it. Are you literally prescribed? or not quite prescribed, but strongly recommended?
We are not direct to consumer, so the way that people interact with us is through healthcare professionals. But yeah, so kind of prescribed, but not technically.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Very cool. All right, you want to share with us where did you start? What are the things you thought about in that second step, and then tell us where it took you.
Okay, so listing obvious problems is, one is compliance. So if any of you guys have been treated by a naturopath or an integrative medical doctor, they give you a whole list of supplements typically. It's like you got your vitamin D, fish oil, CoQ10, anti-inflammatories, turmeric, boswellia. You've got your whole list of supplements you're taking. And sometimes it's hard to comply. You've got to manage that entire stock. You've got to, one bottle lasts 2 weeks, the other bottle lasts 2 months. And so that's a problem. Convenience. You've got people with their pill counters. You got Monday through Sunday. Count all your pills into each container. And then, and there's also dosing restrictions. So the finite number of products, typically if you've got something, it's only dosed in certain increments, so it's not, there's no real freedom to formulate with that. So those are some of the problems. And emotional needs, I feel like sometimes that process can be frustrating, right? It takes a lot of time. Maybe it becomes a ritual, but freeing up time in our society is good and beneficial. And also then there's forgetfulness. If you don't take it, it's not going to benefit you.
Right.
And then the current solutions are inadequate. There's limited options. There's more data now about personalizing things. There's a trend towards that, from genetics research to, just different things. Just the limited number of options is inadequate. And then I think the problem's worse. The worst in the case of, say, special needs children, where you get a child with autism and they're recommended, 10 to 20 different nutrients that they need to take, and then you have to, on top of everything else you're doing, organize all that.
Right.
So I think that's, one of the cases where it's the worst.
Okay, got it. And so as that next step then, having thought about those things in the middle, how could you restate the way you uniquely solve that problem, or how could you restate the problem that people have, taking advantage of the things that you unpack there in the middle?
That's something I would need help with.
All right, got it. Well, first let me clarify who the customer is here, who the consumer is. Is it like, me, the dad who has a child with autism, or is it the healthcare provider who has prescribed, in air quotes, a particular regimen? Who do you see, like when you wrote that out, who were you envisioning?
Both.
Okay.
But the path to, obviously it's the end user. The autistic child's not going to purchase the product. So, there's different paths to that end user.
Got it. Yeah. So one thing to consider, and this like group advice here, is when you go through this exercise, go through the exercise in a distinct way for each person that you're visualizing. So you'd have a page for the doctor, and you'd think through their problems, and you think through what's going on, which is sort of the equivalent of the barista in the Oatly example. Then you do exactly the same thing for the mom or the dad who has the autistic kid, and that's more like the person buying the latte. And those could wind up being two very different lists of things of problems to solve and ways to understand it. And so I'm going to pick like me, like the consumer, the father of someone who has autism, for example. I think that one thing to consider that is what you're really doing is you're making it like the problem that someone has is they deeply want their kid to get better.
Right.
The only reason they'd be willing to deal with 15 different medications and then, read a book a week about how to manage kids with autism or people on AIP protocol or whatever it is, all the use cases that I know you have in your head, they're doing that from a place of deep, fear that this can't be overcome and deep love that they need for it to be. So one thought could be, how does your brand tap into that deep want and desire to actually have the regimen work and figure out how to uniquely position itself as the one all-encompassing, convenient way that allows you to do all the things that, to manage the complexity of this routine such that your kid actually is more likely to get better.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
As a way to kind of take the next step there?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
All right.
Thanks, man.
Thank you.
Volunteer number 1. Hey, where are we on time? Do I have time for another, or do we need to wrap that up and we'll do it offline? Okay. All right. So that was successful to the point where we can only do it once. I'm sorry. But I'm just like the folks earlier said, I'm going to stick around. I am totally interested in all the people who raised their hands and then other folks who were not quite ready to take that step to help you figure this out for your businesses. So thank you very much for the time.